I was initially going to say our next panel, but it's really not a panel as much as it is a conversation between friends. I'll let them tell you more about themselves, but I want to introduce Dr. Kelli Dunlap and Dr. Rachel Kowert, who are both going to be joining us virtually. Dr. Dunlap is, among other things, a full-time practicing clinical psychologist and adjunct professor at American University's Games Center. Dr. Kowert is an author, research psychologist, and content creator. They both do amazing work for the organization Take This, whose mission is to decrease the stigma and increase the support for mental health in the gaming enthusiast community and inside the gaming industry. You can find more information and lots of great resources at takethis.org. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kelli Dunlap, Dr. Rachel Kowert, and once again, your moderator, James O'Hagan.
Okay, I'm just got to stand now. Okay, I gotta look here, but I'm looking at you here. It is so, first of all, I wish you both were here. I wish you were, and I know that you had wanted to try to make it happen, but again, things being what they are, we're gonna make the best of it. And I feel that given that I've gotten the chance to talk with both of you, that you two know each other quite well, this is gonna be just like some amazing conversation that we get to have. But first off, I think it's important to kind of lay the groundwork for the audience as to how you both are psychologists and yet very different types of psychologists. So if you have not yet listened to the full conversations that I have with Dr. Kowert and Dr. Dunlap, which you can find on the Academy of Esports podcast that were done in the last week, please do take an opportunity to check them out, because by themselves, they are amazing people to share their thoughts and ideas. But again, I want to make sure that people understand the differences between the two of you. So Dr. Kowert, please describe as being a research psychologist, which I think is a very particular point to make. How is that going to be different than Dr. Kelli Dunlap, who is a clinical psychologist, but she's also a game designer? So please share, how do you two vary?
I spend my days with numbers, and Kelli spends her days with people. It's probably the easiest way to tease that out.
And again, Kelli, you're more of the qualitative person. So those little leaguers out there who are doing or considering doing your dissertation work, the qualitative work that you do, Kelli, is largely what in that regard?
Yeah, so we actually have two different degrees. So Rachel is a PhD, and I actually have a PsyD, which is technically a doctorate of clinical psychology. And so really the biggest difference is that when Rachel went through her PhD program, it was a focus and emphasis on research around mental health and games because she was doing it. And then my training was mostly clinical and hands-on. So I spent 4 years doing actually in vivo practicum experience as opposed to doing the research experience. Both are fantastic routes, whichever you decide to go. If you decide to do a doctorate, which there's feelings about that. It's lovely and wonderful. But yeah, that's probably the main difference. And when I do research, because I do enjoy research, I like the qualitative, because a lot of times it's like, okay, let's sit down and talk about stuff. And I'm going to ask lots of really nosy questions, which is what I get to do as a therapist. So it's not that different.
Now, again, to open up the conversation for us today, I did send the question ahead of time that we will be leading off with. And I don't know, I'm going to let you arm wrestle for who gets to go first as far as answering this question goes.
I concede.
But it looks like in the chat there's a Take This takeover right now. I don't know if it's because you two promoted the heck out of it to your organization, but we love having Take This a part of this. So through the lens of games making a difference in mental health, what are you most curious about or are researching at this time, and why?
I'll start off since Rachel already conceded. Not competitive at all, let's be very clear. Least competitive person you'll ever meet. So my current area of mental health research around games, I'm really, really interested in streaming. So I've completed a qualitative study around the impact of COVID on the mental health of streamers. So how it's impacted streamers themselves, their communities, basically finding that streamers were acting as first responders for mental health crises across communities everywhere, which is really impactful and fascinating. I'm super curious about, Twitch tags and, why do you use the mental health tag? Why are you using the autism tag? I'm super curious about those things as well. And a big chunk of my interest is in ethics around, okay, if I'm going to be a mental health professional in a streaming space, what are the ethics around that? Because I can tell you our ethical guide did not know streaming was coming, has not been updated to address that streaming is a thing, and that mental health professionals are more and more in a public space. So that is where my current research interests are and what I'm most interested in. Of course, one more place that we do overlap is in the representation of mental health in games. So that's like my baby, and I like to have that one at all times too. But Rachel and I have co-written on that as well.
And Rachel, what are you working on right now?
Well, my work has pivoted over.
What
the
are you
years.
not working on right now?
I do a lot of things. My current work is actually focusing more on the more negative sides of gaming. I've long been a proponent of highlighting the more positive sides of gaming and gaming for stress relief and gaming for social connection. And I feel like in the last 5 years, that dialogue has finally become pushed forward and we're seeing it more in the limelight, which is excellent. But I'm also curious is what are the elements in games and the social spaces in games that may be decreasing the positive outcomes that we may be seeing? Let me talk about hate and harassment and how that might impact the social communities that we're in. Or more recently, my work has specifically focused on kind of like extremism and that kind of more serious forms of what I call dark participation in games. Because it's great, we all know, I think all of us in the room know that games are great for mental health in a lot of ways, but there's certain elements that we can dig deeper and kind of tease out what are these elements that both promote and also might hinder.
Well, and I want to start with some of the things that Dr. Dunlap talked about in her research, and maybe you can share some of your thoughts or ideas, Dr. Kowert, on it, about how Twitch has been a space where a lot of people have flocked to, especially during the start of the pandemic, into the pandemic, where people were coming to not just to find connection, to find people. But what we were finding also, and I know Dr. Dunlap brought this up as part of our pre-conversation as part of the podcast, about some of the dangers of that space of bringing your trauma into online spaces, especially when it comes to trauma dumping, can you explain what trauma dumping really is? Because it's one thing for somebody to share that they have issues or problems, but what exactly is like, because it's the third time I've heard the phrase recently, was the first time with Dr. Dunlap. What is trauma dumping?
So trauma dumping is a phenomenon not unique to streaming, but it's definitely become more problematic and to the point where it has a name now. And it's the idea that you are sharing something that has a high probability of being triggering or upsetting to others, which, you know what, that's not inherently a bad thing. However, the key component of trauma dumping is that it's done against the consent or without the consent of the community that you're sharing with. So if you're in a space where it's like, okay, hey, yes, we can talk about these kinds of things, then it's okay. But a lot of times people will come in, just unload, dump everything that's going on with them. And they're not cognizant of that. They're in a community space. Like you don't stand up on a table in Starbucks and yell about, your divorce or, whatever is going on for you. It doesn't mean that you're not, hurting. It doesn't mean that people won't listen to you or care about you, but there is definitely a sense of consent when we're dealing with emotionally heavy and potentially triggering topics. Another hallmark of trauma dumping is that there's a sense of like, there's no resolution, there's no help. Of like, if someone says something and then you either redirect or you provide resources or just kind of even give that validation of, man, that really sucks. It's never enough. They're always pushing the boundary and there's never a solution, so to speak. And so it can feel incredibly draining on the streamer or the content creator or the community that's trying to support this person, because it feels like no matter what you do, it's never enough for this person. And there's always a bigger catastrophe around the corner. Now, that said, like it's a strain on a community, but there's always this balance, because if someone's coming in and sharing with people these really difficult things in their life, like you don't want to shut them down, you don't want to tune them out, you do want to support them. But it's this balance between what is the community or person able to do and able to provide. And if it's not a match with what that person needs, then there does need to be boundaries put up around what is permissible and what is not.
And that's not to say, you're not suggesting that if somebody is in crisis that we're just saying, well, this is not the space for you and kicking them. necessarily, because again, that it seemed, as you alluded to in our conversation, there were people who were, as streamers, looking for resources, looking for ways to help people. I think a great resource that I didn't know existed and was hard to find, but simply doing a Google search of Twitch Cares brought up at least a starter kit of resources for somebody to help as a streamer who may not be a mental health expert, start to at least direct people in the right way. But this could go for both of you. And I know, Dr. Kowert, you have a whole podcast series called Psychgeist, not Zeitgeist, Psychgeist, which you talk about games and mental health. But we're not suggesting at this point, you being both mental health professionals, that you're going to be doing therapy sessions online.
No, Dr. Dunlap loves to say, I may be a therapist, but I'm not your therapist. No, there's a lot of ethical problems with that. Definitely not. It's about providing information and resources. Definitely. Is when you see somebody who is doing that, who is, let's say, trying to help somebody through, who maybe either is a professional or is maybe, first of all, if they are a professional, I would assume they're called out on ethics, or I don't know how they're called out on ethics or any of that sort of thing. But if let's say you go online, you're going through your Twitch channel and you see somebody who is falling into that trap of there's all of a sudden a trauma dump, or people are just sharing their things, and somebody is reacting to and sharing their perspectives or their ideas or ways to help that person. What is the line? Do you know the line when you see it? What is the line of, oh my gosh, we're stepping into a realm of this needs to go somewhere else. This needs to go to a professional. This is a phone call. This is not a Twitch or a Twitter or whatever platform you're on opportunity to get help.
I mean, it's going to be individual for every streamer, or just someone in your daily life. Like even offline, if a friend is coming to you for support, you really have to pay attention to yourself and what you're feeling. If you're feeling overwhelmed, this is probably not a situation that you can take on. And that's okay. Like I like to emphasize with our streamers and our ambassador programs, they're all mental health advocates, and that's great. But that doesn't mean that they need to be the support for this person. You cannot be all things for one person. That's a recipe for failure and future problems. And so if you are a mental health professional like myself in this space, I'm licensed. Like Rachel said, I'm a therapist, but I'm not your therapist. And that's incredibly important, because no matter what stream I'm on or where I am, even if it's my off time, if I'm branding myself as Dr. Kelli Dunlap, psychologist, people can take what I say as medical advice. And I would never want that to happen. And so if you're a professional, you have to be very cognizant of what you're doing is providing education and information. You are not providing opinion. And dear God help you if you provide a diagnosis. Like that is so incredibly wrong and damaging and potentially harmful. On the other side of the coin.
I want to pause on that for just a second, because
Sure.
I've seen TikTok people who are going out there promoting or talking about certain, in a minute or less, sharing an idea or a thought, where all of a sudden you've got impressionable children who are saying, take me to the store, I need to get this supplement, or take me to, I need to do this. What you just said is very alarming in a lot of ways, because there are a lot of people who are social media influencers, not just on Twitch, but on a variety of different platforms, who do talk about themselves as doctors, who are then talking about the promotion of an idea or a thought. What you just said is incredibly, I don't know if I'm going to say do you see it as a problem right now? Yeah. Either of you?
Yeah. I like to joke that, with our ambassador program, which are streamer to our mental health advocates, really the only problems I've ever had managing that program have come from mental health providers who are overstepping the line. Whereas our people who are advocates are talking about their personal experiences, they're talking about what things are like for them. They are hyper vigilant around that boundary. And they are always very, very clear. I am not an expert. I am speaking from my personal experience. And to that, I think that's fine. Like if you're saying, hey, when I'm going through a depressive episode, something that helps me is X, and you're an advocate, like that's not a medical recommendation. Someone might take it as good advice, but that's a very different thing than if I come on and say, well, what I like to do when I'm feeling the blues. it is a very different thing. And so there is a duty to protect the people in our communities. And when you're able to stream, your community can be people all over the world. And so if you are making broad recommendations like that, like you get this supplement or do this kind of therapy, like I recommend CBT, you are potentially doing harm because you have no idea who's on the other end. You have no idea if what you're saying is maybe antithetical to their culture, upsetting to their culture. Maybe they don't have access. Maybe this isn't appropriate. Like, I can't imagine somebody would ever prescribe a medication without ever speaking to a person. And so there's this very difficult tension between wanting to support, wanting to be there for people, wanting to help and provide resources, but also trying to find that line and what that is. And if someone is an influencer and is making those kinds of arguments, I think it's a difficult area. Like that becomes marketing at that point. And that's why you have things like hashtag promotion and, this is an ad, and ways that content creators have tried to separate this is me versus what, I have to do to make bills happen.
Other than you two, and I will also add Dr. Sarah Hayes to the conversation as being somebody who I trust and would listen to 100% of the time. Are there other people who we can recommend right now? I know we're early in the conversation, but I want to make sure we get this out early. Are there people right now who you would recommend as being somebody to follow who is going to give you, other than your own selves, advice, or when talking about mental health, you should listen to those people, especially whether it's mental health in general or specifically mental health in games?
We have a lot of lovely ambassadors that speak very prolifically on mental health. Anxiety is the first one who comes to mind. She's a really informed mental health advocate, and she's part of our ambassador team. But really, the Take This Streaming ambassadors are all really lovely. They go through a training so they know, it's about general advice. It's not about personal opinion. They're not all mental health professionals, but they all are mental health advocates. So I could recommend all of those folks.
I mean, I think we have to shout out Dr. B. He's the clinical director.
And Dr. B, yes. Yes.
So, and I think one of the things, one of the words you use is whose advice would you take? And I think that's a really important part to hone in on, because I would never recommend anybody take mental health advice from anybody on the internet.
Thank you for catching that. I didn't even know that I had even said it in that way.
Those mad clinical skills, I hear the thing. But like people you can trust in terms of resources, who have an in-depth knowledge, who are good humans who can support you. Absolutely, our Take This Streaming ambassadors are wonderful. We have some friends over at an organization called Game to Grow, and they do amazing work around using tabletop games and tabletop gaming to reach out therapeutically to children's, teens, and adults. There's Dr. Jessica Stone, who was in the chat earlier when I was here. Yeah, she created the virtual, I'm going to get it wrong, I'm so sorry, Jessica, virtual sand tray, which is basically doing sand tray, which is a form of therapy largely for children, but you do it in a digital space so that you can like reach out to more people. There's another colleague of mine who is a friend of Dr. Jessica Stone's. Her name is Dr. Rachel Altvader, and she's doing a lot of work in that space as well. There's Dr. Janina Scarlett. She wrote Harry Potter therapy. She does a lot of work around acceptance and commitment therapy, and she's just this pure human being. I feel bad because I could just go on and on and on, and I'm sure I would still leave somebody out. But one of the great things about being socially connected the way we are is that if you were to ping me on Twitter, I could give you a list. And the games and mental health space is such a small one that we're almost all connected. And so if you find one of us, you're going to find like our little coven, and we're very welcoming. So if that is an interest, you want to know who to follow, you want to know who you can trust, the best thing to do would be to add us on Twitter. I know we all live there, and we can make those connections and help build out this group of people who care about mental health and gaming.
And I believe your Twitter handle, see, it's at Dr. Kowert, so Kowert, Dr. Kowert. And I believe it's Kelli N, sorry. I was like Kelly P. No, Kelly
oh.
Kelli.
I'll just type it in the chat.
Yeah, there you go.
I was not smart. I'm not a marketing person.
Now, not to sow discontent between the two of you. I mean, I don't know where Dr. Dunlap stands on Witcher, but where do you?
Whoa. I am not arguing about Witcher with Rachel. I'm not that brave.
If you do not follow Dr. Kowert, there's two things she tweets about. One is mental health
Yes.
and Witcher. Where as again, one being qualitative, one being more quantitative, one being a clinical psychologist, one being a research psychologist, where do you two find yourselves, if ever, disagreeing about something? Ooh.
We disagree about much. I don't think we disagree about much. I can't think of, I was trying to think, maybe there's like a, I don't know. No, I don't think so.
Ice cream flavors, probably.
Yeah, maybe.
But there's nothing philosophically where you two maybe don't see or see a different tact or a different approach to something?
Not that we've encountered yet.
Okay.
I mean, if we were to pick one, probably the qual versus quant type of approach to research, but that's not a difference in opinion. That's just a difference in like skill set. I do not have the magical statistical abilities to like pull data out of the air like Rachel does. I don't have that skill. And I think quant is very, very valuable. I lean more into qual, one, because that's what I'm more qualified to do. But also, you know, I find it to be a richer text. And so it's not that they are one's good or one bad or will we disagree. We just kind of see the opposite sides of the same coin. And when those two things come together, even though they're kind of the opposite, you get like really, really rich data and you can get really great experiences and information when you combine those two things together. So, and that way we are very different. We have very different preferences, but ultimately they are still working together.
Well, then let me ask you this, since you two share so much, what?
Chris said it. He said it in the chat.
You don't like Final Fantasy VI?
I don't
Who
like
said
Final
that?
Fantasy.
Okay, we gotta move along. Chris
We
in
found
the
the
chat.
thing. I'm not a fan of Final
We found the thing we
Fantasy.
disagree about.
Wait, you're not a fan of Final Fantasy?
I
You
see.
Okay,
As a
James on my
games,
side.
as a game scholar, I see
There's a
its
few
value
what's
and it's
going on in
great.
this room, by the way.
And I love everybody who loves it. I cannot do it. I can't. I'm a shooter person. I'm a puzzle person. I cannot do it. Thanks, Chris. You know, I cannot, those JRPGs, my brain checks out and I nope. So there you go. Thank you, Chris, for sowing discontent.
And I love Dr. Blackman's now getting in on this too, who was here earlier.
Literally Final Fantasy 14. I am willing to learn. I am open to new experiences.
But let me ask you both then this. Again, the game, wow, we opened up a can of worms, I think a little bit in this room. There's like some grumblings going on in here. Oh, Kevin Fair is also not a fan of Final Fantasy. So
Yeah,
hey.
I mean,
Kindred spirit.
yeah, Kevin's awesome. I saw him on the panel earlier and I would happily be his friend in the, you know, Final Fantasy is good for people who like it camp. I support you in your love of it. It's not mine.
Well, I will say I find Halo to be quite boring.
Oh. Okay.
What's
we
that?
need to
Is there
move
a
along.
connection issue? I think it's gone. We're breaking up.
I find Master Chief to just be this boring, faceless character who. I'm not reading the lore.
In the room. Okay. Have you ever played Halo 2 though?
I've played some Halo and I'm you know what it is for me? I can't work the controller. I'm not a good first person shooter.
Failing, not of the game. Sorry, that was a little harsh.
This is totally devolved
I will
now.
I will bring you into my backpack. We will go through the Halo campaigns together and you will experience the joy and wonder that is Halo CE 2 and 3. And then we'll stop there because we'll stop there.
There's many people who are saying good call, good call. Well, let me ask this then, since you two do seem to agree on most important things. Where do you see right now a schism or a change in thought when it comes to games and mental health? Let's talk about addiction, because I know that is a phrase that the World Health Organization has started to talk about as gaming addiction. I know that there are a lot of people who talk about gaming addiction as they toss it around like, oh, they're addicted, they're addicted. We had Dr. Levesque Bristol here earlier. She was talking about self-determination theory. I'm a huge self-determination theory proponent. What is the difference between somebody who is just completely intrinsically motivated by their game and a person who is absolutely addicted to playing video games?
Gaming addiction is not a thing. Hold the phone. Hold the phone.
World Health Organization says otherwise, I thought.
The World Health Organization has officially diagnosed gaming disorder in their new diagnostic manual. The American Psychiatric Association has not followed suit because they say there needs to be more research to determine whether or not there's something intrinsically addicting, behaviorally addicting about games. They have since done a revision of the DSM. It has not moved in to be included. There's a lot of work, a lot of emails and things coming out that suggest that the move for the World Health Organization to move forward with this designation was politically motivated rather than scientifically motivated. They've been pressed to show the evidence. Why did you make this distinction in your new diagnostic manual? They have failed repeatedly to provide any evidence to suggest why they have moved forward with this. And there are several pieces of research. One just actually came out today from Chris Ferguson et al. That has
Love
found
Chris Ferguson.
That it is more likely a maladaptive coping strategy, and there's nothing unique about games as being addicting. So if people are using games maladaptively, which they do, they use it problematically. Some people use it in a way in which it causes harm in other areas of their lives. It is because they are finding it to be a coping strategy that has turned bad for something else, whether it's ADHD, anxiety, increased depression, increased stress, that sort of thing. And why that matters so much is because that completely changes the treatment plan. The way in which a clinician is going to approach this as being games as addicting versus, anxiety, and you are coping with it through the overuse of games is a completely different thing. And the way that just the vernacular uses the word addiction and the way a clinician like Dr. Dunlap would use addiction is also completely different. So I will pass the mic for her to soapbox because we're very passionate about this topic.
I can tell. I mean, wait a second. First of all, this is the most nervous I've ever been around, even though she's not in the room.
I didn't even answer your question. I was like, addiction? No.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, Kelli, go, please.
Clinically speaking, an addiction is a very specific thing. And like, think about nicotine. We know the addictive chemicals in a cigarette. It's nicotine. We know addictive chemicals in other things, benzodiazepines, opiates. These are things that are out of our body. They are not part of our bodies. We take them in and they alter the chemistry of our brain. Now, games do alter the structure and the chemistry of our brains, but it's not because we're huffing Fortnite. It's because it is activating the organic parts of our brain. And so that's an important thing to lay out there first. And then someone always follows up with, what about gambling addiction? And I like to point out that gambling was considered an impulse control disorder, not an addictive disorder, an impulse control disorder up until about 2014 when the fifth edition of the DSM came out. And that's, as Rachel mentioned, the label we have, it might seem pedantic, but as a clinician, if you tell me someone's addicted, I have a framework of how I work with that person. I have an idea of how I want to approach that treatment. And there is absolutely no research at all that has shown that the addiction model that we have for treatment is in any way helpful. And sometimes it's actually harmful to people who are experiencing problematic gaming. And another thing to consider is how stigmatized the label of addiction is. 2 billion people play video games on the planet. This is a massive opportunity to pathologize one of the most popular, if not the most popular activity in the entire world. And the question often comes down to why. And again, not tinfoil hat, but like moral panics are never about morals, they're about money. And if you look at, at least in the US system around how we pay clinicians, insurance won't pay for impulse control disorders. Like I've had insurance reject me for PTSD. I've had them reject OCD because they're chronic conditions. However, you know what insurance does pay for? Substance abuse, going to rehab. These are things where there is a lot of money to be made by feeding into this fear. And what bothers me most about that is that when we're feeding that moral panic, we are actually ignoring, if not actively harming, the people who need our help the most. So if someone's been referred to me for gaming addiction, the first thing I tell them is not, you need to stop that, bad. It's, what are you playing and why are you playing it? What are you getting out of it? What is important to you about this game? Seeing them as a whole person who's struggling with something, as opposed to this really gross stigma we have of somebody with an addiction that somehow they're lesser, or they have less impulse control, or they're dirty, or somehow they deserve what they get. No, I mean, that needs to be thrown out the window regardless of what you're dealing with. Like that's trash. And then from the individuals I work with who are experts in addiction, they're pretty upset about it too. Because one, they don't know how to treat someone who has quote unquote gaming addiction because they're not these same concepts. And I could continue on. However, the last thing I love to point out is that in the ICD-11, there is a differential diagnosis section, which basically says you cannot have gaming disorder if you have these X other disorders. And it calls out bipolar. So apparently rejoice, because if you have bipolar disorder, you cannot have gaming disorder. And I have seen zero research onto why that is. I have no clue.
Well,
Really?
there's
No
also
one has
zero
been forthcoming
research
with that information.
as to why games are addicting. So, I mean, let's just throw it all in there. I mean, and even the thing I like to end with also is you should be a diagnosis of a mental health condition disorder if it negatively is impacting your mental health. But we're seeing time and time again that even if you take the basic metric, which is increased playtime, it does not directly associate with poor mental health outcomes. So why is it in there?
Well, even this morning, Kurt Melcher, in his keynote presentation, showed gameplay with Animal Crossing and what was the other one? Anybody help me? It was Animal Crossing and one other one.
Was it Plants vs. Zombies? Was it the
Yes,
Oxford
yes, it
study?
was. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. It showed that there was an increase in self. What was it? How you feel about yourself?
Reports of like well-being. Yes,
Yes.
that related directly to playtime.
Right.
And there's a really great like mic drop moment in that article. It's like the ending saying like, why are we talking about addiction when we see that increased playtime is associated with more positive mental health outcomes? And if we regulate it globally, we could be actually, as Dr. Dunlap said, causing more harm than good.
Well, and I love that you guys, Dr. Dunlap, you brought up Dr. Chris Ferguson, who wrote one of my favorite books of all time, Moral Combat, which if you have not read Moral Combat, please go on Amazon, go to your local bookstore, go to the the Purdue Library if you're a campus student here, and pick up the book Moral Combat, especially if you're getting into talking about or developing or even just want to get into the business of video games, because guess what? It is eye-opening as to how the research has been led in games and gameplay over the last few years. And really what I found reading it is that we use video games to explain a lot of our own social ills. Like the Columbine shooting was explained away as being, well, they were playing Doom. Sandy Hook shooting was set, the Adam Land, who was involved with the Sandy Hook shooting, committed it, I should say, was addicted to video games, was the phrase that the press liked to use. And really what they found out he was playing was Dance Dance Revolution. So it's not really a violent game per se.
Known for its violent corollaries. Absolutely.
Right. So there's always these ways, especially when the middle class suburban story, the idea that this middle class suburbia is this perfect area and we have no issues here, mental health is not a thing. Once those narratives get broken, in the early 80s, it was Dungeons and Dragons was the big evil. It was heavy metal music was the big evil. And people say, well, violent video games make violent people. One of the great things I love that Dr. Ferguson points out in the book is, if that was the case, Japan and South Korea would have a huge problem because they are bigger gamers than we are in the United States. They play just as violent video games as the United States. But the big difference is the access to guns. So he's like, I don't know. I'm not saying that it's gun access that might lead to more violence, but it can't be video games or access to violent video games. So if you have not checked out Dr. Ferguson's book, please do. And I also did a podcast with him on the Academy of Esports where we talked about a lot of these things. So let's see. So we figured out that there is no addiction to video games. So again, how do we push back against that when somebody like a parent comes to us? Is there, as you talked about, a mic drop moment when we were talking about Plants vs. Zombies and Animal Crossing? I'm a teacher, or I'm a Purdue administrator, or I am Kevin Fair and I'm set up this really awesome experience for kids, and the parents come in and say, that's too violent. I don't want my kid becoming a violent person. Is there a simple answer we can give people so we don't have to go all full Kelli Dunlap and Dr. Kowert on them? Say, watch this for 20 minutes. I know it would be.
Yeah.
But how do we approach that part of the conversation then as lay people?
There's a few phrases that I tend to go to. No matter where I go or what I'm talking about, I inevitably get a parent who comes up to me afterwards and be like, my kid plays Fortnite. I'm like, okay, they're going to be fine. Generally speaking, media effects are incredibly, incredibly small. The way in which media affects our behavior is incredibly small, if not negligible completely. So that's one of the things I say. And the other is, if we look at the uses and effects of games specifically as a whole, over the 40 years we've been studying them, the effects are generally more positive than negative, and at the very worst, neutral.
Yeah, talk about the Anti-Defamation League report, because I know we talked about that in our pre-interview for this conversation that we're having now for the symposium. The Jewish Anti-Defamation League did a report on the state of gameplay that focused on society. And while there were quite a number of negative things in the report, I think it was important to point out that there were also a lot of the positives. So is there anything that either of you took away from that report that really kind of paints a broad picture for you of something that people need to know about? If you have not checked it out already, I highly recommend reading it.
I mean, it reinforces the stuff that Dr. Dunlap and I talk about on the regular, that games are used for social community, that games are used for stress relief, that games provide a space where people feel a sense of camaraderie and they feel they're gaining social and emotional support. And as I mentioned, I think in the last 5 years, we've been doing a lot better at getting that information out there about these positive aspects of games, instead of always talking about violence and addiction, which is of course important because that's at the top of every parent's concern. But the ADL report was particularly, I thought, strong in highlighting in broad strokes these positive aspects as well. Do you have anything to add, Kelli?
I was just thinking, like, how do we not have to go full Kowert Dunlap all the time, which I would be happy to do, by the way. I love this stuff. But it as always, it takes a bottom up and a top down approach. So I am always in awe of Rachel and all the work that she's doing with these large organizations. Like, I know just earlier this week, a project she's been working on with League Spot around bringing esports, YMCA, right? Like, that's amazing. You need broad strokes. You need a trusted institution like the YMCA to say, hey, this is okay. Kids can come here. And like Kevin was saying earlier today, this is a space. You have to educate the parents with trusted institutions. That's a great way to start, and super important to have those broad strokes. As a psychologist, I do not get broad strokes. I get little tiny individual moments, which are also important though. Like, I cannot tell you how many parents I've just had to sit down with one-on-one and let them know, like, okay, you're talking about this game. Let me educate it about this game, or you're worried about this thing. I'm glad that you are, as a parent, I'm glad that you're worried, because honestly, it's when parents aren't worried about their kids that trouble tends to happen. And that I tend to get involved. And so just supporting parents, normalizing, I can't imagine what it would be like to be a parent raising a generation of gamers when you yourself are not one. Like, I know my 5-year-old plays games. I know every game he plays. I've played every game he's played. Like, I know the content in and out. I know the safety settings to put on my Xbox for him. I know what games are okay on the Switch and what are not. And the learning curve, if you're not already in that space, I feel for parents, because they've already got so much going on. And so having the conversations at a small level, whether it's your child therapist, their teacher, Dr. Blackman mentioned earlier that she would assign video games to her students, and that they would sometimes have to CC her to their parents to say, no, really, I need this for my studies. And so it just, all levels have to be involved to break this idea that somehow games are bad. And I know one of my favorite rants to go on is, we've been playing games as long as human culture has existed. Like, there are literally board games from 10,000 years ago, when we went from being nomadic to agrarian. We literally have like Mancala type boards. So the second we sat down, we made board games. And we have continued to use games as a way to connect with one another, to help us through hard times, to manage our own mental health. I had this wonderful slide that I adore from 30 AD from a Greek physician talking about one of the treatments for melancholia is games and storytelling. Like, these are not weird things that have magically popped up. The fact that they are now digital is a little different. The interconnectivity is something that we need to be aware of, especially if we're talking about children and like protecting them. But this idea that games are somehow a waste of time, or that play at any age, again, I missed his name, the gentleman with the beautiful accent, Irish accent.
Stephen Reed.
the
No,
nice
Scottish.
jacket.
Scottish.
I'm
Let's
so sorry.
please.
I'm so sorry.
The Irish
I
won't
am
have
an
anything to
ex,
do
and
with
I
it.
own my mistakes. His gorgeous accent, it was talking about the importance of play across the lifespan. Like, we need to embrace the fact that play is important. Frivolity is important. We cannot be productive all the time. And so if we're looking for a shift in how we see games as parents, we actually are needing to look at a shift in a society that sees people as valuable in and of themselves and not just in what they produce.
I've tried to get my father, who is a former pilot, involved in flying through Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's so hard. Unfortunately, it's a hard to do thing because since he's flown for real, oh, here comes Steven. He's like, did you just he was looking in the window like I had said something awful about him being Scottish, not being Irish.
I'm sorry, the red hair, we got the connection there. It's okay. We're good.
Right. So how do I, like with my father, for example, 74 years old, former pilot, would love to get him involved in at least flying. But we know that there's huge value in the neuroplasticity of gameplay and what it does to the mind when you, beyond just doing a crossword puzzle or beyond just doing a Sudoku, because as we've shown, research has shown just doing those things repetitively, the value of the brain, development through those games as you keep playing them over and over decreases or it levels out. How do we get our adults, our parents, grandparents involved in playing video games? Do you have any suggestion? I'm not saying that you're going to have a real answer or maybe something you found, but do you have any ideas of how do we get our parents involved in playing these games?
Of course we have answers.
Okay, good.
Have you met us? I mean, I guess I'll start. Like my 90-year-old grandmother, she plays Words with Friends. And that's like our check-in. We just play Words with Friends. And so I feel like when you're 90, if you don't want to work on your neuroplasticity, I'm okay with that. Like, I'm not, if it's bringing you joy, I want you to do it. And if there's something I can recommend that I think will bring you joy, I think it's worth a try. I think we need to be really careful about the idea that games can solve all of our problems. And so if you've got somebody who's like, I'm just not into that, we really need to respect that. And so if he's happy with flight sim and that's where he wants to stay, great. And if it's not his thing, like if you had me play a psychologist sim, I probably wouldn't like it either. Because that's something, if you've done in your professional space, you maybe don't want to spend your playtime in there.
Well, you like Ace Attorney, so.
I love Ace Attorney. I've played every game, including the import from Japan, Ace Attorney Chronicles. So good. But it's this idea that, like, I think it's important if we want to invite them. That's my carrot for, my mother and my grandmother is like, if you want to get at me, I'm playing Words with Friends, or I'm playing Drawful is the Jackbox game, but the one on your tablet, because they have tablets, they have phones, or if you're playing Animal Crossing, like I know Rachel can talk for days about Animal Crossing as a way that it brings her family together. And so I think inviting them into the spaces, not so much of, hey, play this game because it's good for your neuroplasticity. It's like saying eat your broccoli because it's good for you, as opposed to, I'm really enjoying this game and I'm wondering if maybe you would want to enjoy it with me. Can we give it a try? And then just kind of taking their lead on that.
Yeah. And I think that digital versions of board games are a great first step. My mom plays Wordle every day, and it's her check-in with my brother. They do it every day, and she's like, I got the Wordle in 3, and he's like, I got the Wordle in 2, and it's like their little thing that they do together. So yeah, I think just opening the door gently, or like Dr. Dunlap was saying, just inviting them in. But if you really want to get them like experiencing video games, my dad would never play. I tried so hard to get my dad to play games his entire life. He never did. But my mom loves like Wii bowling and like those kinds of things. I saw someone said Nintendo Switch Sports. So there are definitely avenues that are like easier. It's hard to just be like, hey, you want to play Final Fantasy VI? Kelli? It's a lot easier to maybe start with like a Wordle or bowling or something like that.
Well, and for my children and I, we set up our own Minecraft realm. Thank you, Stephen, because I met Stephen at a what do we call it? When we met in Schaumburg, it was the Minecraft Con. Mind Fair. Thank you. Yes, we met at a Mind Fair, and right after there, my kids and I set up our own realm. My skill was to dig a hole in the ground and then hollow it out. That was my house. My children,
very valuable skill.
My children are building these elaborate palaces, but also, again, it was. I think there's for some parents, it's that vulnerability. It may not be their interest, but again, your child is asking you to be vulnerable. I have to talk to our GMs in our esports program that they're not always going to be the content experts, and that's hard for a teacher to not be the content expert in the room. I say, well, then be a really good Ted Lasso. If you haven't watched Ted Lasso yet, Ted Lasso knows nothing about football, English football, but is an absolute motivator of people, can get people to work together. Be that person then. If your kids want to get you involved in Minecraft, dig a hole in the ground and just keep digging and hollow it out and do all you don't have to, watch out for spiders. And it's good.
Well, to be honest, my 7-year-old loves Minecraft. I was a little bit too old. Like, I didn't get on the Minecraft train when it started getting popular. I don't like Minecraft. I don't enjoy it, but I played it with her the first time and I was like, oh, look, there's a green guy. I'm going to go say hi. And she was like, but it's her favorite story to tell, that mom doesn't know what she's doing. So even if you fail, it's a fun experience.
Well, what I will say just to Minecraft again, and this was a really important conversation that came out of it, because again, I think it's important for us as adults and our parents even to be in these play spaces with our kids. And I know I had this conversation, I think, with Steven at Mindfair, where my kids were capturing villagers and putting them into caves and like holding them there. And they thought, oh, I can do all this like trading and I don't have to go find these people. And I said, this sounds a lot like slavery. This sounds like you're just holding on to people and keeping them in. Well, and again, a lot of them see a game and how do I complete the game? The game is not always, just because you can win or get resources, you're doing it at the expense of whether it is a fake person or not. You are doing, it's one of these conversations where, again, I think we as adults, while we may not be the best at it, we can have at least a better conversation of helping to put those games in perspective with our children. And I'm sorry, I'm looking over my shoulder just because I see comments pop up and I want to just make sure I'm not missing something important.
Sorry, I'm talking about the time my daughter dumped a bucket of lava in my husband's house that he'd been building for months, burned it down. Oh, that was another teachable moment.
My son's taking down a whole village. I'm like, what are you doing? What happened to this village? I was trading here last week. He's like, I sacked the village. Like, really?
One of the most important parts of play is that it helps us understand the world and our role in it. And so games give us these amazing opportunities to have in-depth conversations around, you could talk about slavery. There's a Sonic game that my son was playing where one of the characters basically realizes he's the bad guy and self-destructs. My son's 5. We have not dug into that yet, but I'm sure at some point we're going to have that conversation about what was going through their mind. And so I think they're important opportunities for us to engage with our kids around serious topics. And then, but also to like normalize this, because you're talking about them like locking people up in Minecraft. My brain instantly went to Sims and like locking people in closets with the sad clown picture to see what would happen. And then the example I like to give at site conferences, because it goes over so well, is I tell the story about how I was playing Red Dead Redemption and I love horses and I had worked so hard for this horse. Like I had finally achieved the horse that I wanted and I'm riding the open range in Red Dead Redemption and I see a woman and she's going, help me. And I'm like, okay, ma'am, I'm here. I'm Dunn Marston. I'm here to help. And so I ride up to her. She grabs me, throws me off my horse, gets on my horse and rides away.
Oh, no.
And my response was, oh, hell no. Oh, no. And so I literally chased her across the map on foot. AI was not smart, thank God. And so I caught up with her. And when I pulled her off the horse, there was a prompt that says, tie her up. And I said, oh, I can do that. So I pushed the button. And now I have bound this damsel. And then there was a prompt, put her on horse. And so I slung her up on the back of my horse. And I was like, there's a railroad line not that far from here. And so I rode with my captive to the railroad track. And if you're familiar with Red Dead Redemption, there's a train that runs in real time and it loops like every 20 minutes. So I laid her down on the tracks and I sat there and I waited for that train to come and I watched her get splattered. I am not a psychopath. I have never hurt anybody. I have no violent offenses. I would never in a million years do that. But the reason I talk about it is because when we are playing games, we are exploring possibility spaces. We are being curious about, the entire time I'm thinking, what's the game going to let me do? Surely it's not actually going to let me go all snidely whiplash here and like put this damsel on the track, but it did. And so it's not about, bringing out the worst in people or like, well, Kelli maybe is actually a psychopath. That's beyond the point. The one I'm trying to make is that when we're playing games, we are in a different headspace. We are open. We are curious. We want to understand the limitations of the space we're in. What are we allowed to do in this space, even if we would never in a million years do that in another? And so I think having that balance is really, really important to understand that like, this is creativity. This is fun. And if like me talking about it, I realize how awful it sounds, but I also know that when I was playing it, the entire time I was thinking, I wonder what it's going to let me do. And so I'm being driven by curiosity to understand the system, which is a hugely helpful tool for an adult human to examine the systems that they exist in and why they work and what's allowed and what's not, and also a teachable moment. Hashtag not a psychopath.
And a game like Red Dead Redemption 2, which has the honor system, depending on how you behave in the game, you develop a system of honor. We have even these games for younger children. Undertale is my favorite game of all time, where you can play it as a pacifist and solve every problem without violence, or you can play it on what they call genocide mode, where you kill everything, and then there's everything in between. The story changes completely based off of how you play. When you go to play it again, even if you choose the name Frisk, then you get like the super hard genocide mode. So yeah, there's these places and spaces where, again, you can have stories within these. Yes, Stephen, if you want. Yeah, sorry. Here comes Stephen.
Sorry. Hi, everyone.
Oh, we got to wrap up.
With the nice jacket. Returns to the stage.
Sorry.
I'll make this super quick, but there's also the other alternative, which is the way I play games, and we talked about this with some people at lunchtime, is I play games ethically as I would in real life. So I will never complete Elden Ring because there are certain things I cannot kill. I don't attack or kill wolves. I don't kill anything that's passive towards me or would be passive towards me as I passed by. Whereas I've got friends of mine that are like, well, you're not going to get that shield and you're not going to get that reward. And I just don't do it. I also played Dishonored using the heart function, which allows you to then make a judgment about whether someone is a good or a bad person. And I couldn't complete the game because there were people that I couldn't then either be violent with in one way or another, or at least kill, or certainly kill. And so even Command & Conquer Red Alert when I was a kid, if I sent a pilot out and he didn't come back, I felt awful because he or she may have had a family. And my friends used to say to me, but they're sprites. And I'm like, but are they? So.
And with that, unfortunately, I'm told that we are tight on time. I thought we had 5 more minutes, Chris, so I apologize because we got started a little late. But I want to thank from the bottom of my heart, Dr. Dunlap and Dr. Kowert. I really wish we had you here so that we could sit here and enjoy your brains so much more. Chris Bishop, I will turn it over to you so you can close us out for the day. Thank you, Dr. Dunlap, and thank you, Dr. Kowert.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, both Dr. Dunlap and Dr. Kowert have been wonderful to get to know over these past few months. It's been fantastic. This entire day has just been wonderful. Thank you again to all the great panelists and speakers for being a part of Games Make a Difference.